Resident Evil Village, aka Resident Evil 8, aka Game with Big Vampire Lady, is the latest main installment in the long-running and much beloved survival horror series. A series that has been as influential as any other. A series that has also changed internally from one title to the next more times than Ethan has had his hands cut off and reattached. To the point that the last few games have been almost unrecognizable from the original Outbreak, the very dawn of survival horror in games. Resident Evil Village is the direct sequel to the sleeper hit Resident Evil 7, a game that had the franchise return back to its roots with the emphasis on ambience, the uneasy feeling that only on-location scares can provide, highlighted by the creeps of the inexplicable and the panic struggle with sustenance and inventory management. Resident Evil 7 tried something new and risky for the series by running the old formula through the lens, the first-person perspective, a gamble that sought to perfect the style of virtual horror while making new converts on the way to redeeming the reputation of the brand-named pinnacle of zombie games. Resident Evil 7 was an experiment that passed a lot of tests. It was nerve-wracking, interesting, and smart, and ambitious, yet restrained dark comedy that excelled as a horror experience, as a tightly controlled FPS. And as an entry in the Resident Evil series, it remains the best in over a decade, or actually the best since Resident Evil 4, the greatest video game of all time and series favorite that reinvented the genre, set the bar for all subsequent franchise entries and games in general. It's a wonder that only now, 16 years later, in lieu of the Resident Evil 4 remake, Capcom decided to take notes from its most innovative endeavor to make a new game that only they are licensed to make, and were once expected to make well. Resident Evil 8 draws cues from RE4, RE7, and even games like Evil Within by the series' own creator to create a package that is once again a genre-bending experience that differs from the OG offerings and traditional biohazards by portraying the supernatural. The result is a decent survival horror game, a good first-person shooter, and ultimately what is perhaps a disappointing sequel.
I won't let you down.
The best and most enjoyable part of the game features the game's best designed, most intricate level, and the most creative marketing material in recent memory, with the giant, seductive vampire lady. You got Lady D and her double Ds and her 9-footed nails that titillate you as much as they terrify you. If you're sneaky, you can get up close and play grab ass with her, or engage in staring contests from afar. Unlike Nemesis or Jack Baker, she doesn't chase you down. She lurks, maintaining her speed and her form, strutting like a runaway model, all the while taunting you, threatening to drain your blood and bathe in your entrails. Her dialogue and her aura all match the tone that the game was going for and that the series specializes in. Everything from the droning score that plays when she approaches you to the clomping of her huge heels making contact with the floor, or the sharp noise produced by the extension of her razor-sharp claws, gives a sense of danger to put you in survival mode. She's the most intriguing character of the game, not just in her aesthetic, but in her narrative and thematic potential. They should have given more priority to Lady D, especially considering how prominent she was shown in marketing. I give her an entire section of the review here because she was the most compelling character of the entire game, a physically impressive and imposing stalker that is consistent with the setting of Romania and its mythical creatures. She's the only villain in the game that really feels like it belongs in the story, with the possible exception of the psychotic puppet master Donna. They were correct to have her as the first boss of the game, but the game needed her gravity a bit more in the latter sections. The game never had more promise than when she was active, and it never reaches the same level of intrigue when she leaves the stage. There isn't much to say for the story other than we are once again on a solo rescue mission, fighting the army of undead, playing as Ethan Winters, one of the most unremarkable protagonists in recent video game history. Although it should be noted that the game is played from the first-person shooter perspective, a mechanic that I theorize to almost purposefully stagnate character development in an effort to create immersion and to give the player a chance to feel as though they are the character they play as. Ethan's a character I want to like more than I do, though he barely exists as one, and is constantly upstaged by the other NPCs on screen. Giving his character more dialogue in the sequel is an attempt to humanize him. The voice actor isn't the problem, as he does well to recite his lines and even sometimes manages to give a good, dramatic delivery, but he only has so much to work with from the game's script, a script that saves its best lines for the antagonists like Lady D and Heisenberg, and the most likable character in the game, the Duke. The Jolly Good Merchant, one of the many callbacks to RE4, has the best one-liners of the game, all the while chilling, smoking his cigars, and letting his gut out. It's a surreal scene full of comic relief. The story makes very little sense until the end, at which point we get the best moments out of Ethan, Chris, and the game's main villain, who, despite small screen time, proves to be a worthy adversary. One of the more difficult bosses in the series, and it is at least an actual boss fight compared to whatever that was at the end of RE7. However, the plot feels disjointed by spacing out the key developments too far apart from one another and instead occupying our time with characters in sections of levels that just aren't as interesting or as congruous as the Baker family and their house from Resident Evil 7. I wanted more backstory about Chris, more time to spend in the castle, more time to be spent being pursued by Lady D. We ended up getting Frogman, and the many encounters with the three look-alike vampire girls that all suggested more but underwhelmed. Resident Evil 8 seemed to know how to introduce its characters, but not how to execute them, both literally and figuratively. The tight controls and realistic shooting of RE7 and 4 return here, making you feel often like you're firing an actual gun with the sway of the barrel, the recoil in between both hits and misses, and the general difficulty of placing accuracy on target, all standards of the playbook. This is some of the best shooting done in an FPS game. Every encounter is one that you have to get under control. There's no micromanaging enemies here. Enemies are aggressive and attack in clusters, always advancing forward and at different angles. They don't wait to take turns. Every bullet counts, regardless of your ammo capacity, because if you let your targets get too close, it can be over quickly. The werewolves constantly swerve at you, distracting your eye like a boxer throwing feints, make an already fickle aim more problematic. You have to pick your shots and make the most out of them, hitting vital parts like the head or knees to stun enemies and make them back off or drop their weapon. Add in the haptic feedback of the PlayStation 5 controller and the triggers and aim feel authentic. The best form of crowd control is with an explosive or collateral, and headshots feel like just desserts. Many of the encounters take place in cramped spaces where nowhere to turn or in a wide open area with little cover. You can use save points and other invisible barriers to offset the enemy advances and to reset the enemies so that you can cheese them and escape death. There are far more enemies here than in RE7, about 300 per playthrough, and the speed of combat is much faster. There is also more ammo, more weapons, and more variety of enemies, each specific to a part of the game, although there are basically only the werewolves and the cloak and daggers for most of the run. I expected more from the service of the stunning RE engine than the dreary black and white tones of the village. I wanted a wider color palette. One example that works is during a fight sequence, an optional encounter with an overgrown werewolf in the cornfield during sunset. The way you're hunted by the prowling, rampaging werewolf as his dark coat blends in the tall golden crops is one of the best examples of level design in the game and an effective scare tactic. Some other examples of sight and sound include the metallic clanks of machines being overworked to mass-produce the mechanized soldiers, the piercing sounds of the drills trying to impale you, the thick smoke rising through the vents of the factory obscuring your vision as you try to escape the buzzing frenzy of the chainsaw propeller man. Definitely one of the coolest, scariest, and most creative enemies that I've seen in a game in a while. Resident Evil 8 gets points for that. And then there's the answer to the question, is it scary? I got halfway through my playthrough of Resident Evil 8 until I got the angst that I felt during the first hours of RE7. By playing Doctor in the basement of the cliffside hideaway house, a situation that is something out of The Ring or Saw. It has the game's best puzzles and makes for one sequence that has to be one of the most frightening and unsettling and weirdest that I've seen in a video game. Being hunted in the dark by a bloody monster that calls out Dada and being surrounded by sneering, malevolent puppets are moments that Resident Evil 8 deserves credit for. The one aspect that is a necessary improvement over Resident Evil 7 is the replay value and overall enemy count. My main criticisms of Resident Evil 7 were that the game was great on Madhouse on a first playthrough, with the constant tension of being stalked by Jack in the main house, but it was less effective on normal mode. Also, that the last section of the game, while well designed, felt out of place, and that the game was too short and there weren't enough enemy encounters. In Resident Evil 8, we get a more action-packed balance with many callbacks to RE4, such as a detailed map and the layout with more open-ended exploration, an economy system to buy from the gunsmith with enough customization to carry over for a few playthroughs, and more enemies to kill on those playthroughs with those weapons, and the Mercenaries minigame that is in some ways better than the actual game. Mercenary should actually be called Mercenary because it's only Ethan. Here you get non-stop action in an arcade survival mode where you choose your loadout and randomized abilities to compete for combos and high scores and to unlock a new weapon for the main game. It's about 10 plus hours of extra content that to me was more fun than replaying sections of the main game, which I should note I completed on hardcore first and then Village of the Shadows, both difficult modes on any playthrough. There are also great bonus unlocks from completing the in-game challenges, like weapons and cheats, and concept art and character models, as well as the making of the game. It's good that Resident Evil 8 has these features and this content, and these are improvements over RE7. Resident Evil 7 was a great direction for the franchise to go, and with the return of third-person over-the-shoulder RE games, there can still be more FPS entries as well, but they have to find the right balance between survival horror and action. They had that in RE7, albeit in a brief game with few enemies. Resident Evil 8 has a greater emphasis on combat, but it lacked the narrative and design cohesion of the previous entry. Although it does add some necessary components that were missing from Resident Evil 7, for a 4-year dev cycle, Resident Evil 8 feels half-baked, and a game I was looking forward to as a marked improvement comes up a bit short. To be fair, I will give it the same score that I gave it to Resident Evil 7, an 8 out of 10. A good game. High form, top tier, distinguished. I liked Resident Evil 8, but I liked the Bakers more. Here's to hoping Capcom do right by Resident Evil 4.